Hollywood's greatest mystery. How did Natalie Wood end up in the water that night? At Movies of the 80s, we cut through the myths to examine the real evidence, discover the truth behind the headlines. Listen now to our special investigation. Hollywood has always produced mysteries, but few have endured as stubbornly as the death of Natalie Wood. On the morning of November 29, 1981, Wood's body was discovered floating in the cold waters off Catalina Island. She was wearing a nightgown, wool socks, and a heavy down jacket. Nearby, a dinghy from the yacht Splendor had run aground on the rocky shoreline. At the time, the ruling seemed straightforward: accidental drowning. Yet in the decades that followed, the details surrounding that night began to fray. Witness accounts shifted. Forensic interpretations evolved. The case was eventually reopened by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and the official cause of death was amended to drowning and other undetermined factors. More than 40 years later, the question that has haunted the case remains unresolved. How did Natalie Wood end up in the water? At Movies of the 80s, we don't deal in conspiracy theories. Hollywood mythology has a way of distorting facts, and celebrity deaths often attract speculation untethered from evidence. Instead, this investigation works from the opposite direction, using contemporary reporting, witness timelines, forensic evidence, and the materials released during the 2011 to 2022 reinvestigation. We attempted to reconstruct the most plausible sequence of events. What follows is not an accusation or a legal conclusion. It is an evidence-based reconstruction of a night that remains one of Hollywood's most enduring cold cases. To understand that night, we begin aboard a yacht anchored in the dark waters of Catalina. The weekend voyage. The trip had been planned as a brief Thanksgiving escape. Aboard the yacht Splendor were 4 people: Natalie Wood, her husband, Robert Wagner, Wood's Brainstorm co-star, Christopher Walken, and the yacht's captain, Dennis Davin. By most accounts, the evening began pleasantly enough. The group had dinner ashore at Dub's Harbor Reef restaurant on Catalina Island. Wine flowed freely. Witnesses later recalled laughter, conversation, and the kind of loose atmosphere that accompanies a holiday weekend. But beneath the surface, tensions had already begun to form. Wood was in the middle of filming Brainstorm with Walken. The production schedule meant long hours away from home. According to multiple accounts, Wagner had grown increasingly irritated with the time his wife was spending working with her co-star. What began as a social evening was slowly becoming something else. Shortly after returning to the Splendor, the atmosphere shifted. Alcohol continued to flow as the group settled into the yacht's main salon. At some point during the late evening, a heated argument erupted between Wagner and Walken. Accounts differ in their details, but several elements appear consistently across witness statements. The conversation turned toward Wood's career and her commitment to the Brainstorm production. Wagner allegedly accused Walken of monopolizing her time. Voices rose. At one point, a wine bottle was reportedly smashed during the confrontation. Captain Davin later recalled hearing the argument intensify. According to his account, he was instructed by Wagner to remain away from the confrontation. What had begun as a tense conversation had escalated into something more volatile. And somewhere during the chaos of that argument, Natalie Wood disappeared. A voice in the dark. Not everyone that night was aboard the Splendor. Moored nearby was another boat, occupied by a couple who would later provide one of the most disturbing pieces of testimony connected to the case. One of them, Marilyn Wayne, later told investigators that she heard a woman's voice screaming from the water sometime around 11 p.m. The voice cried out repeatedly, "Help me, someone please help me." According to Wayne's account, the cries continued for several minutes. At one point, she heard a male voice respond from another vessel nearby, "Hold on, we're coming to get you." The cries, she said, eventually stopped. At the time, Wayne assumed the situation had resolved itself. Boats anchored near Catalina often carried late-night noise across the water. Only the next morning would the significance of what she had heard become clear. The discovery. Shortly after sunrise, a body was spotted floating in the water, roughly a mile from the Splendor. It was Natalie Wood. Nearby, the yacht's inflatable dinghy had washed ashore further down the coastline. The discovery stunned Hollywood. Wood had been one of the most recognizable actresses of her generation, a performer whose career stretched from childhood fame to adult stardom. She had appeared in films such as Rebel Without a Cause, West Side Story, and Splendor in the Grass, and her public image was built on a mixture of glamour, vulnerability, and emotional intensity. Now, at just 43 years old, she was gone. The initial explanation was tragically simple. Sometime during the night, Wood had apparently left the yacht in the dinghy and accidentally fallen into the water. But as investigators began examining the details of the case, that explanation began to encounter problems, because the physical evidence told a far more complicated story. The questions that wouldn't go away. Even in the earliest reports, several elements of the case appeared difficult to reconcile with a simple accident. Wood had been found wearing a heavy down jacket that would have quickly filled with water. Bruises were documented on her body during the autopsy, and the timeline of events aboard the Splendor remained frustratingly unclear. Over time, those questions multiplied. The case was eventually reopened decades later by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which reviewed witness testimony, forensic evidence, and newly surfaced accounts. The official cause of death was later amended to drowning and other undetermined factors. No one has ever been charged, and yet the case remains open. In Part 2 of this investigation, we will examine the evidence itself, the bruising patterns noted by the coroner, the condition of the yacht interior, the location of the dinghy, the timeline of witness statements, and the legal implications of what may have happened that night. Taken individually, these pieces of evidence raise questions. Taken together, they may point toward a far more troubling explanation. Because once the evidence is assembled, a different narrative begins to emerge. One that suggests Natalie Wood's final moments may not have been the result of a simple accident at all. In this investigation, we reconstructed the final evening aboard the yacht Splendor, where Natalie Wood spent her last hours alongside her husband Robert Wagner, co-star Christopher Walken, and yacht captain Dennis Davin. That reconstruction relied largely on witness accounts and the timeline of the evening. But narratives can be unreliable. Memories fade, statements change, and celebrity often distorts the truth as much as it reveals it. Evidence, by contrast, leaves a different kind of trail. When the case was reopened decades later by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, investigators began re-examining the physical record of the night. The autopsy, the condition of the yacht, witness testimony, and the mechanics of the drowning itself. Individually, none of these elements prove what happened. Taken together, however, they form a pattern that has become increasingly difficult to ignore. The autopsy, bruises that raised questions. The original autopsy documented several injuries on Wood's body. These included a large bruise on the right forearm above the wrist, multiple smaller bruises on the legs and knees, abrasions on the forehead and cheek. Crucially, the medical examiner determined these injuries occurred before Wood entered the water. One bruise in particular, the one located on the forearm, has drawn significant attention in later forensic analysis. Its placement is consistent with what investigators sometimes refer to as a defensive injury, the kind that can occur when someone attempts to shield themselves during a physical confrontation. None of these injuries conclusively prove an assault, but investigators reviewing the case decades later noted that the number and location of the bruises are not easily explained by a simple slip or fall while boarding a dinghy. In other words, the physical evidence raised the possibility that a struggle occurred before Wood entered the water. Inside the yacht, investigators also examined the condition of the yacht itself. Photographs and reports describe the interior of the Splendor as being in notable disarray. Broken glass was reportedly found in the salon. Candle wax had spilled across surfaces. Drinking glasses were scattered, and counters were cluttered. At the time, Wagner suggested the mess had been caused by rough seas. But the Splendor had been anchored in a relatively protected cove near Catalina Island. Weather reports from that evening did not indicate conditions severe enough to cause the kind of interior disturbance described in photographs. This discrepancy may seem minor, but investigators often rely on exactly these kinds of environmental clues. A cabin in disarray can be the aftermath of a lively party, or it can be the residue of something more volatile. The dinghy. The inflatable dinghy attached to the Splendor was found the next morning beached along the rocky shoreline south of where Wood's body was discovered. Its condition raised additional questions. The oars had been tied down. The ignition key was reportedly turned off. Scratches along the side suggested that someone may have attempted to climb back into it from the water. If Wood had intentionally taken the dinghy away from the yacht, investigators would expect the vessel to be operational and moving away from the anchored boat. Instead, the evidence suggests a far more chaotic scenario: someone in the water, attempting and failing to climb aboard. The witness in the night. Perhaps the most disturbing testimony connected to the case came from a woman on a nearby boat that night. Marilyn Wayne told investigators that she heard a woman screaming from the water sometime around 11 p.m. The voice repeatedly called out for help. According to Wayne's account, she then heard a male voice respond from another boat nearby, saying words to the effect of, "Hold on, we're coming to get you." The cries continued for several minutes before stopping. At the time, Wayne assumed the situation had resolved itself. Only the following morning, when news broke that Natalie Wood had been found dead in the water, did she realize the potential significance of what she had heard. Her account later became one of the most unsettling elements in the entire investigation. If accurate, it suggests that someone aboard the Splendor knew Wood was in the water, and that help may not have arrived quickly enough. Alcohol and the mechanics of drowning. Toxicology reports showed Wood's blood alcohol level at approximately 0.14%. That level would have significantly impaired balance, coordination, and reaction time. Combined with the environmental conditions that night, the danger increased dramatically. A nightgown, wool socks, and a heavy down jacket. Once saturated, the jacket alone could have added dozens of pounds of weight. Cold Pacific waters, darkness, alcohol impairment, and heavy clothing would have created a lethal combination even for a strong swimmer. The official cause of death was drowning, but forensic analysis cannot always explain how someone ended up in the water. That question lies outside the autopsy report. The timeline problem. One of the most persistent questions in the case involves the timeline of Wood's disappearance. Statements from those aboard the Splendor indicated that Wood's absence was not immediately noticed. At some point after midnight, Wagner reportedly realized she was missing. Radio calls to nearby vessels were made around 1:15 a.m. Witnesses later described those calls as sounding quizzical rather than urgent. A broader search effort did not begin until much later. To investigators reviewing the case years afterward, the timeline raised a troubling possibility: that Wood may have been in the water for a significant period before a full search was initiated. If true, that delay could have had fatal consequences. The legal question. The central issue in the case has never been whether Natalie Wood drowned. That much is established. The unresolved question is what placed her in the water in the first place. If a confrontation occurred and Wood entered the water during a physical altercation, the legal implications would change dramatically. Even if no one intended her death, an assault that leads directly to a fatal drowning could potentially constitute manslaughter under California law. If someone knew she was in the water and failed to act with reasonable urgency to rescue her, investigators might consider whether that behavior represented reckless disregard for human life. These are complicated legal thresholds, and proving them decades later would be extraordinarily difficult, which helps explain why the case remains unresolved. A case that refuses to close. The death of Natalie Wood continues to occupy a strange space in Hollywood history. It is not officially ruled a homicide. It is not fully explained as an accident. Instead, it remains something more ambiguous. A case suspended between competing narratives, shaped by incomplete evidence, fading memories, and the complicated dynamics of fame. The reopening of the investigation by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department confirmed that authorities themselves believe unanswered questions remain. More than 4 decades later, the night aboard the Splendor still resists a definitive explanation. But when the available evidence is examined closely, it becomes increasingly clear that the simplest version of the story, the one that dominated headlines in 1981, may also be the least convincing. And until new evidence emerges, the final moments of Natalie Wood's life will remain one of Hollywood's most haunting unsolved mysteries.